Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today I am fulfilling a promise I made just over 5 years ago in one of my more popular videos called The Last Days of Socrates. And so I'm going back to that volume today and I'm looking at the Phaedo. Okay, the Phaedo is in this volume called The Last Days of Socrates, put out by Penguin Classics. I'm going back to the very end of the book, and it's, as I said, it's one of the longer dialogues of Plato. In this volume, it's about 85 pages maybe. I read it all yesterday in 2 sittings, and I think that the fact that it took that was a good day's reading was probably intentional. Never assume, like when you're with someone like Plato, the writer, never assume that anything he does is accidental. So I assume that the fact that it took a day to read this and it covers Socrates' last day on earth was, I think, probably intentional. So it gives you the real feeling that you're in the prison with Socrates' friends who are visiting him and staying with him until sunset, when he has to drink the poison that the Athenian jury judged that he has to drink to kill himself. So the dialogue takes place in his prison cell, and you get a few interesting biographical details. One of the most interesting phrases in the dialogue is that it mentions that Plato, it says, I believe Plato was ill. So the dialogue is being told by this Phaedo, who is telling it to his friend Socrates, and Socrates wasn't there, but he wanted to hear about the story about Socrates' last day. So Plato has Phaedo telling the story of what he witnessed on Plato's last day, and it's a very beautiful dialogue because it blends Socrates' life and obviously Plato's love and respect for Socrates with a very apt discussion of the soul's immortality. So in several different dialogues, Plato proves that the soul is immortal, and he does it in slightly different ways here and there. But if you want a snapshot or an encapsulation of Plato's arguments for the soul's immortality, the Phaedo is a great place to go. I think most people encounter it in the Republic because of all Plato's dialogues. People tend to read the Republic. So the Phaedo is an amazing dialogue. It's perfectly constructed. It's compelling. Again, it has that blend of biography with philosophy, and they're so deeply intertwined. So let me just go over it quickly, because in that video I did called The Last Days of Socrates, I promised that I would look at the dialogues more in depth, and 5 years have passed, and I've always intended to do that. So here's me fulfilling my promise. So the Phaedo, again, most of Plato's dialogues are named after one of the people in the dialogue, and since Phaedo is telling the story of the dialogue, it makes sense that this dialogue is called Phaedo, the Phaedo. Okay, so it begins with basically, obviously, this Phaedo running into Socrates in Athens one day, and they're looking back on some time in the future about Plato's death, and so Phaedo talks to him about that. So the first thing that happens, basically, again, some other interesting tidbits, is Socrates' wife is in there with him, and then he kicks her out, and somebody's servants takes her home. Socrates spends his last day with his friends, doing what he loved, talking about philosophy. And it's interesting here that, again, she'll reappear, the wife will reappear later at the end of the dialogue and bring some of their children, and he says goodbye to them and blah blah blah, and then kicks them out. So isn't that just interesting how in this day and age we kick the friends out for sake of the wife and kids, but he did the opposite? There's something to think about there. Draw your own conclusions. I'll draw mine. So it begins with, sensibly enough, Socrates talking about how how he views death. He's not upset, and he's kind of looking forward to it, and he wants to convince his friends not to be sad, but in fact, since they love him, to want this good thing for him. So he spends some time talking about how one should live one's life pursuing truth, and that if anyone deserves to have a reward in the afterlife, it's the one who's dedicated himself to the truth. So he's going to then spend the next while, in fact most of the dialogue, proving a few things. He's going to prove that the soul pre-existed, and he's going to prove that the soul endures after death, and he's going to discuss a few other things. And the last thing he does is he describes the world. And by world, I would say picture something like Dante's view of the world, so that heaven and earth are physical places. And he seems to believe that the world is a sphere. He says that, or Plato says that clearly, that the world is a sphere. And he talks about the rivers flowing downward and then being pushed up on the other side of the world and flowing around. And even more interestingly, he talks about the world above this world, which is kind of new to me in that sense that he wisely opines that not everything is as it appears to be, in the sense that just because we think things look the way they are, we have to remember that that might just be how they look to us, because we have physical limitations. So one of the most interesting things he says to me is that the world, if you were in the ocean and you looked up, you would see the sky, and you'd think that that was the heavens and that was the world above, but you know that it's only the world that we walk on that you see from under. And he describes the world of the underwater as murky and muddy and kind of gross. And he says that compared to that world, the world on the land is better. And he says so much better is the world above the land. And he says that, he sort of says that the world above this world, again, if you flew up, he said, you would see, well, you might not see, but the soul would be able to see sort of a crystalline, perfect world. He says that things like gemstones here, beautiful gemstones here, he suggests, is sort of like they fell from the sky down onto the world. And he says that the world up there is just so much better than the world here. And it's a physical place, but it's also obviously a metaphysical place too, because you can't get up there unless you are pure. So his proofs, as I said, his proofs are pretty standard for Plato. He talks about how basically most of the dialogue is about how the body and the soul are different from each other, and that the body has one set of characteristics and the soul has another set of characteristics. And he uses Plato's most common argument of recollection. And I think that it's easy to discard Plato's observations because they seem weak in some ways to us. And I don't, like, for my part, I don't buy them. Like, they don't convince me, but I appreciate them. And I think they're very difficult to argue against, and you have to be pretty clever to see what's going wrong with the arguments. Some of them are just arguments by comparison, in the sense that you look at a behavior and say, well, these things tend to be this way, therefore they are this way. But again, there's so many important things here that even if you disregard his proofs, then you have to appreciate, and you have to see the implications for world culture for what he's saying. Now, when he's talking, after he talks about the relationship between the body and the soul, and how the body is basically garbage and tends towards death, because as soon as the soul leaves the body dies, it disintegrates, because it's not pure, it's a mixed reality. It's got hair, it's got muscles, it's got nails, it's got blood, it's got all these different kinds of things, whereas the soul is a single substance. He doesn't use the word substance, but it's a single thing, and therefore single things don't decay like mixed things decay. So one of the big things he talks about, one of the arguments made against his ideas about the soul, is the Pythagorean idea that the soul is a harmony or an attunement. So Pythagoras, if you know very much about him, Pythagoras was very much into music and mathematics and so on. And he described the soul as a sort of a perfectly tuned instrument, like a lute. A lute would be similar to a guitar or whatever, a banjo or what have you, a little harp. And Socrates dismantles this argument because he says that if it's an attunement, then how do you account for different kinds of souls? Like, if the soul is a perfection, an attunement, then what is a bad soul versus a good soul? And so if a bad soul is out of tune, then what is that? And he says that this doesn't prove you can't have an immortal soul with Pythagoras' idea. And then it's also objected that durability is not immortality. So one of the interlocutors, Cebes, says that, just because things last, it doesn't mean they're immortal. I suppose you could say, for myself, I have a few of my grandfather's tools. I have one of his hand saws, a few other things, and obviously his saw outlived him, but does that mean that it's going to outlive me? Or if I pass it on to one of my sons, maybe it's going to be completely rusted by then. Maybe it will fall into the lake and get rusty or something and fall apart. So that's one of the arguments, is that just because the soul lasts doesn't mean it's immortal. And so when Socrates gets this objection, he says, well, I guess you guys didn't understand what the argument from recollection proves. Okay, so the idea of recollection is basically this proof. So we know things that are white, we know things that are tall, we know things that are friendly, we know things that are whatever, but we've never seen white, we've never seen friendly, we've never seen tall. So how do we have these notions? And this is an argument later that Descartes, in about 2,000 years, is himself going to, when he talks about the idea of infinity. We've never experienced infinity, so where did we get the idea of infinity? And Descartes says, well, we simply have to say that God gave us this idea. Whereas Plato will say that, no, well, he says the same thing, but he says, we've actually experienced infinity or whiteness or tallness or friendship or courage or whatever. We've experienced it in the realm, in heaven, or wherever you want to call it, in the realm of the forms. We've actually seen these things themselves. And so when we're born, we have the knowledge of these absolutes, but we don't have knowledge of any particulars. And so learning, he says, is a process of trying to remember these things. So whereas someone like Locke would completely disagree with that and say that knowledge only comes by way of the senses. A better position, probably than both of them, is Kant's position that our brains have the ability to, it has these fundamental laws in it, principles, and we're able to sift experience and so on because we have these principles of judgment and so on. So I'm not going to sort of flesh those out. It would be kind of beyond me at this moment in time. But I like this argument of Plato's because we really have never experienced things. So how do we know where this knowledge came from? Like, you walk into a room and you see a table. How do you know it's a table and not a chair for tall people or people with huge bums? It's because we have seen tableness and we've seen chairness and all that stuff in their previous life. So it sounds dumb, but again, if you take not the example of a table or chair, but the example that Descartes likes is the example of infinity, it makes a bit more sense because we have not experienced infinity. But we know it. We somehow know it, and we know friendship, and we know hot, and we know tall, and we know beautiful, and we never experienced those things. So Socrates returns Cebes to that, and he says, "I guess you're not getting the implication of the argument from recollection. The soul. This doesn't put soul into long lasting. It puts soul into immortal because these concepts are absolutes. They're not laws, like great laws of, the American Constitution that come and go, or they're not the 10 Commandments that have lasted for a couple thousand years. These are absolutes, right? So we can say that they're even more absolute than, say, gravity, because we can think of a universe where gravity is different than it is. We talk about the gravitational constant and all that. I'm not qualified to speak on that, so I'm just using it as an example. We can conceive that the laws of gravity are different, but we can't conceive, for instance, that whiteness or tallness or beauty or truth can be different from what they are. So they're in the infinite category. They're not in the durable category. So that's really the bulk of the argument. And so Socrates has proven pre-existence, and he's proven the soul's immortality. And again, you've got to go through this dialogue carefully. I mean, I've been reading Plato for years, and there are passages that are difficult, and you kind of have to wrap your mind around them and see what they're saying. And there's these throwaway statements. They look like throwaway statements, and you're like, nope, that's really important. So I got to go back to that and figure out what he's trying to say there. So it's a beautiful dialogue. It combines both biography and philosophy. I was fascinated by, again, Socrates' description of the earthly paradise at the end, so the last maybe 10 pages of the dialogue. And you get, of course, the final description of Socrates taking the poison, the hemlock, and it's slowly paralyzing him, and then he dies. So at the end, he says, his friends are crying and stuff, and he says, well, I guess you don't understand the stuff I was talking about if you're going to cry, because you don't understand that this is a great thing for me. But he does say, there's an implication here that the friends are sad not because they don't see that Socrates is going to a good place, but they're going to miss him. And that's not expressed explicitly, but it's obviously the motivation, what's going on in the hearts of his friends. And the very last sentence I'll read to you. It says, "Such Socrates was the end of our comrade, who was, we may fairly say, of all those whom we knew in our time, the bravest and also the wisest and most upright man." So again, it was these couple dialogues that come in this volume called The Last Days of Socrates that just completely captivated me and changed my life. Reminds me there's actually a passage in this dialogue, which I never noticed before, where it talks about Socrates coming across a book of the philosopher Anaxagoras. And Anaxagoras, it's about 2/3 of the way through the dialogue, he says that he was so excited when he was reading Anaxagoras as a youth, and what he loved was that Anaxagoras said that mind produces order and is the cause of everything. This explanation pleased me. Somehow it seemed right that mind should be the cause of everything, and I reflected that if this is so, mind in producing order sets everything in order and arranges each individual thing in the way that is best for it. And he goes on and on. And he was so happy that, and he says later that this explanation was after my own heart. So it just felt right to him. But then a page over, he says, and I kept reading Anaxagoras, and I realized he didn't follow through on that idea. That Anaxagoras himself didn't follow that principle. And he said, as I read on, I discovered that the fellow made no use of mind and assigned to it no causality for the order of the world, but adduced causes like air and ether and water and many other absurdities. Okay, so Socrates likes the idea that mind is the cause of order. Mind is that the world is beautiful and good and just and all these things because there is a rational principle that governs the universe. Obviously that's God, or that's the forms or whatever. And he didn't like when Anaxagoras didn't follow his own principle through, his own principle forward. And so Anaxagoras was more like Aristotle in that sense, and he looked at more particular causes. But the fact that Socrates has this idea of the world is truly extraordinary, and it says a lot about Plato's conception of philosophy, and that it is, and you really get into this, is that to Plato, it's ideas that matter. It's not things. It's not the world. It's the higher world that matters. It's ideas, that truth and beauty that matter. So I always say that you're either a Platonist or you're wrong. Just kidding. Couldn't help that joke. So you're either a Platonist or you're a Aristotelian / Lockean, and you look at particular causes or grand causes. And I think I used to talk about Christian Platonists as if there were another kind of Christian, but I see Christianity now is intrinsically Platonic, and so there are no non-Platonic Christians. So I'll leave that controversial statement at the end here, in case anyone wants to argue against it, take exception to it, or require deeper explanation. But I really enjoyed reading the Phaedo again. It's been a few years. It's really just one of those works that I find really uplifting, and I would put it in the category of any of the great religious works of world history. And that's all I have to say for now. Thanks guys so much. Please subscribe and all that business, and we'll be back with another video soon, I hope. Bye now.